Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be discussing the Romantic Period by Robin Jarvis. So the subtitle is The Intellectual and Cultural Context of English Literature, 1789 to 1830. It's part of the Longman Literature in English series, and it looks like it's a cool series. I'm sure eventually I read other books in the series. Um, this book was kind of a mixed bag in a sense that it wasn't exactly what I wanted. When you look at the title, it wasn't exactly what I wanted, but nevertheless, I'm definitely walking away with a bit more knowledge of some certain things. Some of the chapters were really interesting. I especially like the one on history, on historiography, really, on which chapter was that? On the writing of history and the historical mindset. So it is called Beaupetit, A Sense of the Past. It's chapter 7, the second last chapter. Um, the book really reads like a series of lectures. Good lectures, long lectures. I don't know, maybe 2 hours, 2 hour lectures or something. And it sort of has that feel of a really polished presentation. That these lectures were that the author gave these lectures year after year and added and embellished them and made them really good. Now, starting out, the main issue I have with the book is it's my issue, and it's why I went to get to read the book, to buy the book and read the book. Um, was I was I was expecting a lot of references to the actual poets and writers of the period, 1789 to 1830. Uh, but there were very few references to the poets. There were a few references to Coleridge, um, really, really rare references to any other poet. And that's how you have to look at this book. It is really the context of the age. So I'd almost get rid of the word literature in the subtitle. The intellectual and cultural context of England, 1789 to 1830. Um, that was my major problem with the book. Other people might not have that, and nevertheless, it'll teach you a lot about the era, and you'll be able to say, okay, well, these are the things that influenced Keats, or these are the things that influenced Jane Austen, or whatever. Um, there was some good references, for instance, to uh, Wollstonecraft. I always get her name. I'm sorry. Uh, Mary Shelley's mother, the feminist. And there were some good things on her dad too. Goldwyn. Um, but generally, it was very contextual. Talks a lot about the French Revolution. So that happened in 1789. So that's the beginning period, of the beginning moment of this, according to Jarvis, of the Romantic period. And 1830 is kind of just a useful moment when most of the most of the great poets like Keats, Shelley, and Byron were dead, I think, by 1830 because they lived very short lives. Um, and it's kind of cool that in the chronology at the back of the book, it has 1830 Tennyson poems were published. So Tennyson is not a romantic, but it's kind of cool that at the end of the period, Tennyson takes over. And nothing says Victorian as much as Tennyson does. And that's the year that George IV died. July Revolution in France, and Greek independence was achieved from the uh, Ottoman Empire, which is the context in which Byron died. Catholic emancipation was granted the year before, and repeal the Test Incorporation Acts and so on. So it's a good moment. I mean, it's a good starting point, good ending point, really. So if you look at that, 1789 to 1830, 41 years. that's one good generation or two short generations, I suppose. And I've always thought of the Romantic poets in terms of two generations. So the first generation is Wordsworth, Coleridge, and I suppose Blake. And then the second generation are these young rebels, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Anyway, if you're looking for historical context and background, which I wasn't really, I wanted more references to the poets and how they exemplified these currents of thought, whether they were exemplified in their writings and so on, then this isn't the book for you. But if, like, I have history background and I have lots of knowledge of history and all this stuff. I mean, you don't know everything, and so even reading this, I learned a few things, which was cool. But it wasn't what I was looking for. Just hang on one sec here. Sorry, I had to plug in there. My battery's not the best. Okay, so let me read out the list of chapters to you, and I'll be able to say a few things about each of them or whatever. So the first is called the maybe if I can find it on Google Books or whatever, I'll put the index on, or sorry, the table of contents on. First chapter, political and economic scene. If you don't have the historical background, that's pretty vital. The next chapter was really interesting, and it was definitely beneficial to me. It's called Travel, Exploration, and the Geographies of Mind. And so it's talking about the attitude of how the British worldview was changed by basically, I mean, obviously the discovery of the New World and subsequently the colonization, the cross cultural fertilization, like getting to know those cultures, Africa, China, North America, and all that stuff, getting to know those situations and how the knowledge of those scenes and sort of influenced the thinking of British people. The literary marketplace, it's always interesting, like just to know, like, that's chapter three, literacy rates and so on is okay. It's interesting. Um, Education in the family. This chapter, education in the family. If you read any number of novels um, from the period, you know what education was like. If you read even the later era, like Charles Dickens or whatever, you know what education was like. And so reading Jane Austen or whatever, you get a sense of what education was like. So it's nothing. I mean, there's nothing really surprising in that regard. The next chapter is really good. It's called Science, but it was really long, and for probably from my perspective the most difficult chapter because it talked about the development of science and so on. I'm not a scientist, but nevertheless, it was interesting and makes you think about people like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. Goethe was very involved in the development of scientific thought at the time. And of course, someone like Keats, who was training to be an apothecary, knowledge of the body, physiology, and all that stuff was important. The next chapter was religion and ethics, and I found it was kind of interesting. Um, so it talks about things like the growth of atheism, the different the growth of what do they call it, evangelicalism, uh, from how important that was. And again, if you read in this case George Eliot, she you know all about the religious context of England at the time. That's something that George Eliot was very interested in, and certainly um, shines a lot of light on for us to know the situation of religion. Like I'm thinking about like Adam Bede, or even Middlemarch or whatever. Um, so I mentioned chapter seven, sense of the past. Basically, how not like new knowledge of archaeology, um, literature, what enabled the development of what they call historical consciousness, an awareness that the past is not like the present, Now, you might say, well, isn't that pretty obvious? It's not pretty obvious because when you look at most paintings from the past, you have people wearing costumes that were not, in the paintings that were not of that era. You have mentalities depicted in literature and so on that were not of the era. And so this was a time where it was discovered that people were not the same, in that context, environment, um, the means of production, technology, economy, these things affected people's basic conceptions of the world. And so this was a period of time when that really began to be thought about, and history books began to reflect historical consciousness. And the last chapter was aesthetics and the visual arts, um, which was okay. I was glad that they talked about the interest in nature, because that's isn't that one of the basic things about the Romantic era? If you can say anything about it, the Romantic era was especially interested in the natural world. And of course, obviously, Wordsworth is the greatest example of that. And to see how an interest, for instance, in landscape painting basically was in this period and is really basic. I mean, it's basic to us today, but it really developed in the Romantic era. So let me just go back for a second. I had one of the good things about this historian, and we learned this when we write when I did a history degree, was there's a real consciousness in universities that histories need to pay a lot of attention to, what they call the marginalized people, um, colonized people, women, children, um, lower classes, other races. And I liked that. You could learn stuff about that. And I found it interesting that, again, chapter 2 on travel and such, really interesting analysis of Australia colonization versus, say, Tahiti. Was it Tahiti? I guess it was. And the differences of the people, the way the settling, the colonization occurred, and so on. But occasionally, this interest in, again, what we would call the marginalized people, like, and I love history that looks outside of the wealthy, the aristocrats, which was ancient history was only, I should say, traditional history was only interested in aristocracy. I like history of the common person or whatever. Um, there can be a backhanded side to that, and it could be portrayed as a so it almost as if you got to rub the white man's face in it or something. Um, so let's, for instance, there was an unfortunate phrase in chapter 2 that Jarvis said something about before the white man ruined the environment or whatever. So talk about colonization. There was a phrase something like that, before the white man ruined it, or muddied it, or something negative. That's not history. That's A historian should not use phrases like that. Again, there aren't many of them, but they're there. And another example, for instance, would be in the religion and ethics chapter, where Jarvis says that the Anglican Church had a stranglehold on education. Now, stranglehold has a negative connotation, and I think it's easy to say that education was blessed by Anglicanism. Not an Anglican. That the gift that the Anglican Church was to education, or Anglicanism was to education, can just as easily be said. You can make a case for that, and I would strenuously make a case for that. Um, so stranglehold is an unfortunate phrase. Um, Monopoly would be a more neutral phrase. Um, and so anyway, there's a few phrases like that in the book. They're written for the left wing intelligentsia and publishers and university people. They're a little bit unfortunate, and but there's not too many in this book. Um, the author doesn't let his bias go out too often. But again, as I said, it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for more of a reflection on the world as seen in the writings of the great poets and writers that I'm interested in. But it wasn't that. It was like the world, here's the world, and now go off and do your study of the poets. Okay, those are two different things. They're not contradictory, but we only have so much time for reading, so we want the book that we want. And what else? Again, I learned a few things that were valuable, and I'm grateful for having learned them. And there you go. Is it a difficult book? Again, I found the chapter on science a little too long, but I was really glad that the author talks about Charles Darwin's grandfather and the contribution he made, Erasmus Darwin, to science and so on. That Erasmus Darwin, again, not nearly as celebrated as Charles, his grandson, but he was very influential, and he laid a lot of the groundwork for his much more famous grandson's discoveries and so on. So overall, pretty good book. Read it if you don't know a lot of history. It will help you in understanding these writers. But if you're not really interested in the history, this is not the book for you. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing great. Sorry that I don't make videos as often as I'd like. I don't know, just not never. I never feel well. Okay, if you believe in God, pray for me. I don't know what to tell you. Best thoughts and feelings. Anyway, take care, guys, and hopefully be back real soon. Bless yous.